On the morning Columbia was supposed to come home, nobody watching from the ground knew the disaster had already begun 16 days earlier. Not during re-entry, not over Texas, not in those final seconds when Mission Control called out about tire pressure and got only a broken reply. It had started less than 82 seconds after launch. A piece of foam, something NASA had seen before, slammed into Columbia's left wing. The crew kept working. The mission kept going. The science kept going. And for days, the people on the ground convinced themselves it probably wasn't fatal. But on February 1st, 2003, as 7 astronauts came back to Earth after a successful mission, the shuttle began to die from the inside out. Sensors failed. Debris started coming off. Temperatures rose where they never should have risen. And by the time anyone understood what was really happening, Columbia was already lost. This is the true story of the space shuttle disaster that didn't begin at landing. It began at launch. On January 16, 2003, On January 16, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia rose from Kennedy Space Center on what looked like a routine mission. It was STS-107, the first shuttle flight of the year, a 16-day science mission packed with more than 80 experiments. On board were 7 astronauts: Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, David Brown, Kalpana Chawla, Laurel Clark, and Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut ever to fly in space. Columbia was not heading to the International Space Station. She was flying alone, carrying research that touched medicine, biology, combustion, engineering, and earth science. From the outside, it looked like a proud American mission, doing exactly what the shuttle program had promised the world. And emotionally, it had everything: a veteran orbiter, a tight crew, a mission built around discovery. Rick Husband had dreamed of space since he was a kid watching the moon landings. Willie McCool talked before the mission about how the technology they were building would belong to the children who came next. Laurel Clark spoke about how lucky they were to see Earth from above. Ilan Ramon carried the pride of an entire nation with him. These were not distant symbols. They were people at the height of their lives, doing work they believed mattered. Then, just after liftoff, something happened that did not look dramatic enough to change history. At T plus 81.7 seconds, a large piece of insulating foam broke away from the external tank's left bipod ramp. At T plus 81.9 seconds, that foam struck Columbia's left wing, around the reinforced carbon-carbon panels near the underside of the wing leading edge. To anyone watching the launch live, there was no visible catastrophe. Columbia kept climbing. The mission continued. The crew reached orbit, but the damage had already been done. That is what makes Columbia so disturbing. The moment that doomed the shuttle did not look like the end. There was no explosion, no sudden fireball, no dramatic alarm. The crew had no reason to believe they were flying a mortally wounded spacecraft. And because shuttle launches had seen foam strikes before, there was already a dangerous habit inside the system. People had begun to treat an abnormal event as if it were survivable, simply because previous flights had gotten away with it. NASA's own later reflections would connect Columbia to that same pattern, the normalization of deviance. Over the next 2 weeks, Columbia's crew worked around the clock in 2 alternating shifts. They ran experiments, recorded footage, spoke with students, and lived inside the mission they had trained for. From orbit, Earth looked peaceful. Sunrise over the horizon looked almost unreal. Inside the orbiter, this was a successful flight. Every image from those days is hard to watch now, because history makes each ordinary moment feel fragile. They were not surviving a crisis. They were doing their jobs, smiling, floating, working, and preparing to come home. On the ground, however, some engineers were worried. The foam strike had been seen on launch video. Concerns spread through engineering channels. There were efforts to understand how serious the impact might have been. But the images available were poor. The later CAIB findings say the lack of high-resolution imaging seriously hampered the assessment. The board also found that managers ultimately declined to pursue the kind of on-orbit imagery that might have revealed the true extent of the damage. That decision has haunted the history of Columbia ever since, because it captures the central tragedy of the mission. Not only was the shuttle damaged, but the people responsible for understanding the danger never truly forced themselves to confront what that damage might mean. And that is where the story becomes more than a technical failure. Because Columbia was not only destroyed by foam, it was also destroyed by confidence, by habits, by a structure that made it easier to manage concern than to confront it. The board would later say plainly that management practices were as much a cause of the accident as the foam that struck the wing. That is one of the most chilling conclusions in the history of American spaceflight, because it means the threat was not just outside the vehicle. Part of it was built into the way the system thought. Then came the morning of February 1st, 2003. Columbia began re-entry over the Pacific at 8:44 and 9 seconds a.m. Eastern Standard Time. At first, nothing from the outside world suggested what was unfolding inside the left wing. But less than 5 minutes later, onboard data began showing abnormal strain and temperature signatures in the wing's leading edge region. These were some of the earliest signs that superheated plasma had breached the wing during re-entry. The temperature and strain data were not all visible to the crew or mission control in real time, but the orbiter itself was already being eaten from within. As Columbia raced across the western United States, pieces of debris began coming.